There's a moment in your financial life that feels almost unreal. One day your account looks small and fragile, and then suddenly, quietly, something shifts. The numbers start behaving differently, growing with a weight you didn't feel before. Hitting 10K isn't about the money itself. It's the first time compounding stops feeling symbolic and starts feeling personal. That's when momentum wakes up. Most people underestimate how different money behaves once you cross that first five-figure line. Before $10,000, every step forward feels painfully slow. You save a little, the market drops, you save again, something breaks in your budget. It feels like a loop with no acceleration. You're pushing a snowball with your bare hands, and all the weight is on you. But once that account crosses into five-digit territory, the texture of your progress begins to change. Your contributions start landing on a real base instead of disappearing into tiny fluctuations. At this level, your portfolio has enough mass to react when the market moves. A normal month of growth can add more than you use to contribute manually. A dividend payment no longer looks like loose change, it actually registers. Even a 1-2% market shift shows up on your screen in a way that gets your attention. The numbers feel heavier, as if gravity finally discovered them. Nothing magical happened mathematically, of course. What changed was the relationship between what you add and what the market adds. Below 10K, you carry nearly the entire load. Above 10K, the market begins to help you push. This is also the moment where most people confront a strange emotional twist. The growth still feels small, but for the first time, it feels real. You start to see that tiny seed of compounding that financial books always talk about, but that never shows up during those painful early months. A $50 gain used to feel meaningless. At 10K, that same $50 feels different because you didn't manually put it there. It just appeared, quietly, automatically, without your effort. That psychological shift is enormous. It's the first time your money does something without you, and there's another change happening underneath the surface: stability. A portfolio under 5K dollars behaves like a leaf in a storm. One bad week can erase everything, but above 10K, the daily noise stops wiping out your progress. A red day feels annoying, not devastating. A dip feels like a sale instead of a warning. You begin to understand, almost intuitively, how long-term investors stay calm. They aren't calmer because they're braver. They're calmer because the size of their base absorbs the shock. This early momentum also teaches your brain something crucial. Consistency works, even when it feels slow. When you look back and realize that your first 10K came from dozens of small transfers, small choices, small sacrifices, something clicks. You see the pattern, you see the math, and you realize nothing about the process was luck. It was the accumulation of actions that were too small to feel meaningful in the moment, but too powerful to ignore over time. The real beauty of reaching 10K isn't the number, it's the identity shift. You stop feeling like someone trying to get started, and you start feeling like someone who's actually building something. The doubt softens, the habits solidify. The plan becomes more than a plan. It becomes momentum. And momentum, once it appears, behaves very differently than effort. It grows while you sleep, while you work, while you live your life. It grows quietly, steadily, invisibly, until one day it no longer feels small at all. Once you move past that first $10,000, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Your portfolio starts to build a memory, not in the literal sense, of course, but in the emotional one. You begin to notice patterns. You start recognizing how the market behaves during different seasons, how your contributions land depending on timing, and how growth responds to even small changes in your routine. Eventually, it feels like your money isn't just sitting there, it's interacting with you. This period is where most long-term investors quietly transform. The fear that used to dominate the early stages starts to retreat, replaced by curiosity. Instead of wondering, what if I lose everything? You find yourself asking, what happens if I stay consistent for 10 more years? That shift in questions is the moment your financial brain matures. You stop focusing on the next week and start focusing on the next decade. One of the biggest psychological changes after 10K is that market movements stop feeling personal. Earlier, every red day felt like an attack on your progress. Now it feels like the natural rhythm of a system that has much bigger cycles than your individual emotions. When the market dips, you don't panic. You adjust your perspective. You remind yourself that you own actual businesses, not the temporary price printed on a screen. You understand that volatility is the cost of admission, not a signal that something is broken. This is also where your routine begins to harden into discipline. You no longer question your monthly contributions. You expect them. You don't negotiate with yourself about skipping an investment. You treat it like paying your rent or your phone bill, non-negotiable. That consistency is what takes people from fragile beginnings to durable momentum. The system rewards the investor who doesn't need to feel motivated every single month. Around this stage, you also start experiencing something that beginners rarely understand. Compounding isn't just math, it's behavior. When your contributions become automatic, your emotions stop interfering. When you check your portfolio monthly instead of daily, you remove unnecessary stress. When you treat investing as a long-term relationship rather than a short-term fix, everything becomes calmer. You stop trying to outsmart the market and instead focus on outlasting it. Another quiet but important shift happens to your identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who builds wealth, not someone who wishes for it. You take pride in the structure you've created, the habits you've built, the discipline you've shown. That identity change is what keeps people going when the numbers move slowly. Once you see yourself as an investor, you stop acting like someone who is trying. And then, gradually, the reward becomes visible. You start noticing that your portfolio grows while your life continues in the background. Work, relationships, ordinary days. Your investments don't need your permission anymore. They grow with or without your attention. That's when you realize the real magic of compounding. It works hardest when you're not looking. This middle stage between 10K and the next major milestone is not glamorous, but it is transformative. It's where your habits deepen, your confidence expands, and your time horizon stretches. You're no longer hoping for momentum, you're living inside it. And you begin to understand that the next stage won't require more effort, just more patience. Somewhere between $10,000 and your next major milestone, a very specific kind of financial confidence begins to form. It doesn't look loud or dramatic. It doesn't show up as celebration or excitement. It shows up as calm. You start noticing that money no longer feels fragile. The early fear that every setback could erase years of effort begins to fade, replaced by a grounded sense of progress. You understand now that temporary drops don't erase long-term growth. They simply reshape the path a little. This is the phase where your portfolio starts moving in ways you didn't think were possible a few years earlier. A normal month might add a few $100s in growth, sometimes more than you used to save manually. A strong quarter can surprise you with gains that once seemed unrealistic. These aren't life-changing numbers yet, but they're meaningful enough to make you pause and recognize the shift. The snowball is rolling, and for the first time, you're not pushing with full force anymore. One of the most valuable lessons you learn in this phase is the power of neutrality. Great investors don't overreact to good months or bad months. They see both as part of the same long-term structure. When your account grows by a few thousand, you don't assume you've become brilliant. When it drops by the same amount, you don't assume the plan is broken. You begin to trust the process rather than your emotions. There's also a new kind of motivation that appears here, one grounded in evidence. When you see compounding, working at a level that feels tangible, it becomes easier to stay committed. Before, people told you it will work eventually, and you had to take their word for it. Now you're watching it happen in real time. That's when discipline becomes identity, and identity becomes momentum. This stage is also where you begin to appreciate the value of margin in your life. not financial margin, but emotional margin. When your investments support part of your expenses, even indirectly, everything feels a little lighter. A car repair becomes an inconvenience rather than a crisis. A slow month at work doesn't send you spiraling. You start experiencing the earliest version of financial breathing room, and it changes your relationship with money entirely. You also begin experimenting with ideas that once felt out of reach. Maybe you learn more about ETFs, dividend growth strategies, or tax efficient accounts. Maybe you explore small real estate investments or increase your savings rate. You're not chasing magic, you're simply improving the structure that already works. That curiosity is natural and healthy. It's a sign that you see money not as a burden, but as a tool you're learning to master. And perhaps the most profound shift in this stage is realizing how close you are to the next level. When you look back at the slow climb from 0 to 10K, it feels like a different lifetime. Now you're moving faster, not because you changed who you are, but because your base finally has the strength to compound. This is the stretch where the gap between effort and reward begins to narrow. You give the system consistency, and it gives you momentum. You give it patience, and it gives you growth. This quiet expansion phase is where wealth stops being a dream and starts becoming a structure, something that grows with you, supports you, and follows its own path, regardless of how busy your life becomes. You're no longer building the foundation, you're building on it. And from here forward, everything accelerates. When your portfolio grows past that early threshold and momentum becomes part of your financial life, something subtle but profound happens. You stop thinking only about getting ahead, and you start thinking about where you're headed. The pressure that once sat on your shoulders begins to dissolve. The constant mental noise about money, progress, and catching up turns quieter. In its place comes clarity. The path in front of you finally feels real, not like a dream, not like a theory, but like something you can walk with confidence. This is the phase where your decisions stretch far beyond the next paycheck. You start making choices based on who you want to be 10 years from now, not tomorrow morning. You begin to understand the real value of consistency, not because it feels good, but because it works. You've watched your habits reshape your financial life, and now you trust them enough to build a bigger future on top. At this stage, you realize something that almost no beginner sees. Wealth isn't built by intensity. It's built by repetition. You didn't sprint your way to momentum. You showed up month after month, year after year, even when it felt small. The early transfers nobody praised. The boring months nobody saw. Those were the bricks. And now you're standing on the foundation they created. You also gain something even more valuable than money: time freedom. Not full freedom yet, but early hints of it. When your investments start generating growth that rivals your old monthly savings, you suddenly have breathing room. You have options. A bad month at work doesn't threaten your stability. A new opportunity doesn't feel impossible to explore. You have space in your life that wasn't there before. And that space is where new chapters begin. One of the most important realizations in this phase is that the journey doesn't get harder, it gets lighter. The early climb was steep because everything depended on you. But now, every dollar you added years ago is working quietly in the background. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't lose focus. It doesn't skip months. It compounds relentlessly. And with each cycle, it pushes you forward without needing anything in return. Eventually, you start seeing what this momentum can become. You notice that 10K turned into 20K faster than you expected. You see 30K forming on the horizon. You understand that your money is no longer something you carry, it's something that carries you. That realization is rare, powerful, and life changing. And here's the quiet truth: most people never reach this phase, not because they can't, but because they quit before the system finally works. They stop right before compounding wakes up, right before the slope changes, right before momentum arrives. You didn't. You pushed through the hardest part. You made it past the phase where growth feels invisible. Now you're standing at the starting line of real acceleration. So, as you look toward your next milestone, whether it's 25K, 50K, or your first six figures, remember what got you here: patience, consistency, and the courage to keep going when it still felt slow. Those habits built your foundation. Those habits created your momentum, and those habits will carry you into every next chapter. You're no longer just saving, you're building a future that compounds. And this is only the beginning.